Let's take a look at Jamaica's inflation over the years. So, in our columns, we have the year, we have Jamaica's inflation rate, we have the inflation rate of the United States, the inflation rate of the world, the variance between Jamaica's inflation rate and the US, and the variance between Jamaica's inflation rate and the rest of the world. So let's look at the JLP's first administration between 1962 and 1971. The overall inflation between 1962 and 1971 was 45.03%, right? It had a low of 1.41% in 1962 and a high of 14.71% in 1970. So overall, 45.03% over that year. They were in power for 10 years, so we divide 45.03 by 10, we get an average inflation rate of 4.5%, right? So 4.5% inflation, average inflation over the years the JLP was in power for its first administration. The US in the corresponding year had inflation of 30.96, which is an average inflation of 3.10% per year. So Jamaica recorded inflation of 1.41% higher per year during the JLP's first administration than the United States and what the United States had in the corresponding year. Let's move on, which is not bad. 4.5%, not bad. US 3.10, a variance of 1.41% per year, not bad. Moving on. So the PMP's first administration was between 1973 and 1979. So we realized that the PMP had significantly higher inflation rates per year than the JLP's first term. They had as high as 34.90% inflation in 1978 and 29.08% in 1979, right? So the total inflation for their first term from 1973 to 1979 was 147.18%. So if we divide that by 7, which is the number of years they were in power, full years they were in power, we get 21.03%. So they averaged 21.03% between 1973 and 1979, which is horrible and they should be ashamed of themselves. At the same time, at the corresponding period, the US's total inflation was 57.48%, an average of 8.21%. So um so Jamaica averaged 12.81% per year higher than the US's inflation from 1973 to 1979. The PMP should be ashamed of themselves. Moving on. Between 1981 and 1988, because remember, we're skipping the election years because both parties were in power that year. So there was a change. That's an election year, and there was a change in the power structure. So we're not using those years, we're using the full years. So JLP's first full year after they won the election in 1980 was in 1981. They had a full year, right? So their total inflation between 1981 and 1988 was 114.38%, an inflation rate of 14.3% per year, which is horrible, and the JLP should be ashamed of themselves. For the corresponding period, the US's total inflation was 31.16, an average inflation of 4.65 per year. For the rest of the world, the total inflation was 65.19, an average inflation of 8.15. So Jamaica had a 6.95% worse inflation per year than the US and 6.15% worse than the rest of the world per year. Again, JLP, you should be ashamed of yourself. All right, let's move to the 17-year reign of the PMP between 1990 and 2006, in which they destroyed the country. They didn't they helped, I should say they helped to destroy the country because, I mean, both political parties destroyed the countries based on the numbers. So, between 1990 and 2006, right? The total inflation was 347.32%. Divide that by 17, we get an average inflation of 20.43%. So during that 17-year reign of the PMP, they averaged 20.4% inflation per year. Again, shamed of self. Shamed of self. Shamed of self. I should build a song. Shamed of self. Shamed of self. Shamed of self. PMP and JLP's theme song. So in 1992, we see that the inflation rate was 77.30%. I don't know how how do you get inflation to be 77.3% in a year when the the inflation in the corresponding year for the rest of the world was 7.71. I don't know. I do not know. PJ Patterson will have to answer that. So 20.43% between 1990 and 2006 was average inflation per year. At the same time, the US's inflation per year was 2.91% and the rest of the world was 5.71%. So we were 17.52% higher per year than the US and 14.72% per year higher, right? Than than the rest of the world. That's the average per year. Let's move on. So between 2008 and 2010, total inflation in the JLP was 44.22%. Average inflation per year of 14.74. Same period, the US was 1.71%. The rest of the world was 5.08%. We were 13.3% worse than the US and 9.66% worse than the rest of the world. And this is per year. So 13.03% per year worse than the US and 9.66 per year worse than the rest of the world. Between 2000 and I think you guys have gotten the drift, right? So let's move down to the conclusion. Right, no, let me cover these 2 years. Between 2012 and 2015, the total inflation under PMP was 28.17 and average inflation per year of 7.04, which is the first time we have seen single figures under the full years and administration has been in power. Woot woot. At the same time, the US was 1.32% and the rest of the world was 2.454%. So we were even when we were averaging 7% per year, we were 5.7% per year worse than the US and 4.51% worse than the rest of the world. But again, single digits, and compared to what we have seen, I'll give them a small clap for that. Still not good. So moving on to the JLP between 2017 and 2023, total inflation was 39.5, I'm sorry, 39.94, and average inflation of 5.71. Again, give them a small clap because compared to the figures we have seen, this is decent, right? But at the same time, the corresponding period, the US's inflation was 3.49%. The rest of the world was 3.73%. So we were 2.22% worse than the US and 1.98% worse than the rest of the world, and that is per year. All right. So let's look at the summary. So the average inflation per year in power of the JLP in all of their terms from 1962 until 2023 is 10%, right? No, that is not good because considering that Jamaica's inflation target is between 4 and 6% currently. So this 10% is an average. So they have averaged 10% in all of their years of being in power from 1962 until now. That means they have failed every year if we're going to use the average of 10%, right? Now the PMP, they've also failed, right? 16.17% per year of all the periods per year during all the periods they have been in power from 1962 until 2023. These people should be ashamed of themselves, considering that the target inflation is between 4 and 6%. They have both failed every year if we use the averages, right? Also, I don't know why our inflation is between 4 to 6% when countries like Canada and the US, their target inflation, and the United Kingdom, their target inflation rate is 2%. Now, these are developed countries, right? Why, if we want to become developed, which I highly doubt, but if we want to become developed, why wouldn't we have an inflation target in line with these countries? So that's something that somebody needs to answer for me. If you found this video useful, please like, share, and subscribe to my YouTube channel.